nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Hey, welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. Welcome to the Black Miss Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. Back to normal today. Thankfully, I will not be being interviewed on my own show, which honestly is strange. But I think that was a solid episode. We covered racial reckoning, or myth of racial reckoning, as an introduction to the book that me and Rasul wrote, who is back today as a normal guest. About laundering black rage, the washing of black death, people, property, and profits. Just as last week, if you want to get that book at a discounted rate, that information is in the show notes for 20% off. And since Rutledge is not cheap, I would definitely encourage you to take that 20% off. We might run some kind of special for people on the Patreon, but we haven't figured out the mechanics of that yet, so I don't want to announce something and butcher it. But speaking of the patrons, I do want to shout out the people who have signed up over the last month. Sounds of St. Elsewhere, Jamila Alexander, Rashid, Nick, Jordan Davis, and then there was somebody, I don't remember the name off the top of my head, who they did not join, but they jumped from like, they're giving a lot more a month than they used to. I think it's Sis Lion, and then I want to shout out the free members, Casey Richmond, and I think that's it. And bye to all the people who canceled. But other than that, today's myth is the state is the government. This will be probably more controversial than racial reckoning. I think most people agreed that racial reckoning 2020 was not a thing, particularly the listeners of our show, but it was still good to get a more in-depth analysis of what exactly went down and understanding our theory. This one is, I think, much more commonly held, and some people will even say that, we're wrong in even saying this is a myth, that the state is a government, that when you say the state, that is synonymous with the government, and that nothing else belongs to that definition. So most time we hear people say the state, they're just talking about, the department of so-and-so, or Congress, or the president, or the mayor, or city council, or public school. That's generally what people call the state. Now, we're not saying that's not part of the state, but that's not the extent of the state. So with that being said, Rasul's the one who kind of pushed me on this one, because I definitely used to call the state just the government, and I still find myself doing it from time to time just because it's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. So just want to check in with y'all, Ryan and Rasul, before we get into any of the in-depth part of this, just kind of like a reflection on that myth and just the commonality of it, because a lot of people are going to think we're crazy for even pushing this one. So
no, for real. And to your point, I even equated the state with the government as well. That was until, I believe, I don't know what episode it was, but reading that portion and how Rasul's definition expands the definition of the state to other entities. And that's the first time I've actually have heard that done, and it offered a much broader perspective for me. What is the state? And I'm actually pretty excited to have this conversation, this episode, because to dispel that myth for a lot of people, as well as to understand the state is, I want to make sure I get it right, more like a network, like of different entities all working together for special interests. Would you say that? Am I correct in saying that? I don't want to misrepresent your definition.
I think that's a way to kind of begin to try to understand it as something more, and I think we'll get into it, but I don't think it's a thing where we need to be bogged down with accuracies. Accuracies. It's more like, how do we examine what's happening? what are the things that inform our understanding of what's happening, and then the different ways in which we can try to make sense of it. And so you're trying to make sense of it, and so you're thinking of it as a network. I've done different things to try to make sense of it and come to and come to different analogies. I think the most recent one in a conversation I had with Two Black was thinking about the state as a sort of like aquarium, right? So because even in having this sort of definition that we'll get into of the state, we can still kind of miss the point that there are things that are outside of even the state, right? The state is a thing that has been created and established to handle all of society, and so the people who create it as a means to maintain their position aren't inside; they're outside. So if we think of the analogy of an aquarium, we have things like, of course, the different types of fish that are sort of going around. We have at the top maybe some sort of something.
Bigger fish like sharks, or not sharks in the same aquarium, but
I mean, if you have multi-species, right? Within the aquarium, you have snails. You may have snails. You may have different types of fish that go in different particular places, but also you have different things that operate the aquarium, right? You make an aquarium. Because I remember when I was younger, that was a thing, right? So
the rocks on the
right. You have the sand base. You have the rocks on the bottom. You then begin to put little things on top of the sand, like the little pirate ship for the fish to go through, or the fake logwoods where the fish may go inside, or the plant, real or plastic, more than likely plastic, that will also be taking up some type of space, because of course these type of species like to either hide sometimes or do things in their prison that we've created, as a child. And then as we move up, and this is what I was kind of alluding to, when we move up, to the top part of the aquarium, we have the air filtering system, right? We have the lights that, there's different types of lights that, provide different type of growth. Sometimes there's some type of feeding instrument so that we're not dumping all of this food, onto the water, and, the fish, eat themselves to death. There may be things that sort of allow for more controlled feeding. And so thinking of this aquarium gives us then, this sort of relationship inside the state, but it also alludes to there's something outside of the state, right?
Okay.
And so I had never thought about it before, so hence it's not something that's in the geography as a threat. But
or laundering black rage,
or laundering black rage, but it's just one of those things when I'm working with people, talking to people, and I'm trying to be responsive to their attempts to try to make sense and understand it. So when I'm hearing their attempts to try to make sense of it and understanding, it forces me to try to figure out better ways to explain it. And that was just something that just came out of nowhere, and it sort of really helps. And so again, for our listening audience, none of this may make any sense at this particular point. Hopefully we'll come back to this aquarium idea, but as we get into this discussion of these concepts that sort of produce an understanding of the state, and even not just the concepts that produce it, but the types of literature that produces an understanding. Because for me, there are different ways to understand the state that aren't necessarily wrong. They just tell me how a person understands it to only be government, right? So if some people only read a certain sort of line of text, then I can understand why they can only think of the state as just government. But if you read a whole nother line, in particular, any line that includes Marx, I just don't understand how you can just think of government, because one, Marx evolves in his own interpretation of the state, and he arrives eventually, later on as being something greater or more than government. So again, for me, when I'm hearing people mention the state, I sort of listen a little bit more of where they're, where they potentially reading from. And again, if they're reading certain texts, I completely understand why they're only looking at state government, because maybe they're in political science or whatever else, and they look at government, theory and, foreign relations, international relations. That makes complete sense for that type of understanding, and maybe even critiques of that space within that space. But if those of us who try to, think in more critical and radical terms, I'm trying to avoid using all of the catchy, terms of abolitionists and anti-imperialists and
yeah, because a lot of times those get ran into the ground, and then they'll be co-opted, and it loses meaning over time. So
and also, like, in many cases, like, if I haven't gotten anybody out of prison, like, I don't want to claim being an abolitionist, you know what I mean? That's just, I mean, I know this sounds so basic, but
at least try to get somebody out of prison.
Yeah.
I guess to kind of bring it back to the book, even The Laundering Black Rage, for me, when I was trying to understand it, to understand laundering, and we talked about fronts and all that in the last episode, it was like, okay, what is the kind of entity that helps regulate all of that? And it's not really one entity. Like, when we say the state, it's like Rasul said, it's an aquarium with all these things happening inside of it. It's not like, so aquarium is like we understand anything scientific, like aquarium is like technically one thing, but then there's all this stuff happening inside of that one thing, right? And there's also not just like one state around the whole world, and then that's also not what we're saying. Like there's just, now you can get into class and interest and capital and who controls and cross borders, but that's not what we're getting at. But it's just like, okay, how do you legitimate the conquest? Was, for me, like, I saw the state as the primary way to legitimate conquest and all the various things that come with it. So when we think about like enclosures, for those who know like some of the earlier history of capitalism, and that, peasants worked off the land and they had control over effectively the means of production, and then getting kicked off the land and having to go work for capitalists. And then the land, the water, the resources from that land is now privatized. And then you have to work to get access to that land, whether it's through your wages or through your work, right? The aquarium is very similar to that, in the sense that these animals are not in the ocean. They're in an aquarium, and they're being put into almost like a simulation of the ocean. And they have to work within that space because they've been moved from kind of their natural habitat or whatever. So human beings, the state moves you away from the things you would regularly do just within your own so-called, I guess, kind of, for lack of a better term, nature, and it puts you in service of the people who own the aquarium.
Right.
It puts you in service of the people who conquered you and that class of people, and then it puts you in service of the people who want to perpetuate that level of ownership, from generations on. So the state becomes this thing with all these different entities, and government is one of the major pillars of it, but it becomes this thing with all these entities to maintain it. And then laundering just becomes, like, for me, like a way of governing all those different things and moving things around and making it seem like you're making your way out of the aquarium, but you're not, And then the rage, whenever you actually realize, like, I'm in an aquarium and you start banging on the glass or something, right, there's a way to like funnel you back and act like this isn't even there. Right. Like, that's kind of what I didn't really think about it with the aquarium, obviously, but I'm saying in relation to that analogy, that's kind of how we're trying to understand Black rage And the capital, or what we call white capital, it wants to keep you within that container. So to say that government is the only thing that keeps you in that container
makes sense. Yeah.
It just doesn't make sense. And it's like, we'll get into it, but I'm saying even within the longer history of what we would call government under capitalism, or particularly in the United States, for those who live here, government wasn't even always really that big. So it's always weird to me when people are so emphasize government that much, because government didn't really intervene that much in terms of like the different ways of life. A lot of that stuff was privatized for long periods of the United States. And then when you get into the Keynesian era, like we talked about in the prison episode, or the prisons were private episode, government starts to expand. You start getting more social welfare. You start getting more services taken care of. You get the so-called middle class. The military grows. Imperialism and colonialism existed prior, but I'm just saying, as far as government intervention in everybody's daily life, it wasn't even really as big of a deal in a different era. So anyway, we'll I don't want to do the whole episode. I'm not being interviewed, but
right.
Like, but I'm just saying, like, just to give people a sense of like why this isn't connected to the book. The state is how we understand like the front that helps put laundering in motion and helps launder your rage. It's foundational to the theory of laundering. So we're not just so for people that want to understand in relation to the book. So this monologue is actually not, I didn't write this. Rasul, when I was writing the original essays, I don't even know really where you just sent me this, because I just been talking to him about laundering, and you told me I could use it, but I don't like taking people's shit. So I think I took literally one sentence out of this, and people are probably going to read this like, why do you steal all of this? But so this doesn't have a name or anything. It's just something I think you just wrote. But this is in relationship to laundering in the state. Cling, a state of being free of that which is deemed to be dirt, grime, soil, stain, filth, blemishes, or marks. The unclean is thought to be rife with disease that can in turn cause worsening conditions of health and well-being. This association with disease production, association with contamination, is the basis for cleaning. To clean is for the production safety, albeit a tenuous safety that requires a constant cleaning to make it so. Surfaces, tables, countertops, windows, mirrors, streets, or cities necessitate constant cleaning, as motion and actively ultimately increases the likelihood of dirt. The greater the thing that needs to be cleaned, the greater the power that must be called upon and clean the thing. Power is the water pressure gun that is brought out every morning in New Orleans to clean away the grime of the revelry that was happening just hours before. Power is the volume of trucks employed in Chicago to shovel away the mountains of snow after every storm. Power is a legion of people who are now employed downtown corridors of Raleigh, North Carolina, London, England, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. Power is the deployment of violence workers who sweep the streets of the homeless, the black, the unruly, the other, the disposable in Portland, Oregon, Indianapolis, Indiana, Paris, France, Hong Kong, China. This is cleansing, and it costs. But the aim is still nonetheless the production of a state of cleanliness. A state free of dirt is to be clean, and for a brief moment, it can be attained and enjoyed. This is why we clean our plates, clean our utensils, clean our glass, clean up our cup in order to eat. Is it clean enough? Who cares? We eat, don't we? The act gives us the confidence whether or not the clean is indisputable. Laundering is not cleaning, or not really, about producing a state of cleanliness or a state of free dirt. Cleaning is converted to cleaning, quote unquote. It is solely imitating an act done for the state of cleanliness to enact something else for something else. And what is that something else? Undirt, not clean. Laundering is the pursuit of state of undirt. On the surface, this appears to be the same, once again, denoting the ways that laundering plagiarizes actual cleaning. But laundering never does cleaning. It does, quote unquote, cleaning. Cleaning is the material world, quote unquote. Cleaning is the immaterial, ethereal realm. Streets, much less countertops, are irrelevant. Hell, even eyes are not important. If it feels clean, then it is. So laundering is making something, quote unquote, clean by simply moving the dirt or the debris away not by actual scrubbing. This is why laundering at an entry level is money from there on ceases to actually work with any material thing in most works of fiction that dominates our mind and perception of what laundering is. But money always has takers, not owners, from The Wire. So what is being quote unquote cleaned is not the money, but the person who is possessing it. And just like the magic of laundering, it is made evident. Laundering is undirting people, governments, and states. Cleaning can never be achieved by the stain of the first dirt was too great, but the amount of continued dirt is greater, and even greater yet the objective has always been the dirt. The playfield is solely in the dirt. The accumulation of wealth is the dirt, i.e. land. So power is still used, but not in the same way as cleaning. It appears more as influence. Influence is the underwriting of the insurance with red, yellow, green, blue lines to the property that is not worth anything to begin with, but we are made to believe that the issue was that some individuals were wronged by no insurance rather than a system of false insurance to begin with. Influence is autoimmune response built into the social systems of the academy that then produces ready individuals who will call for calm or joy or any unrelated thing in the midst of rage derived from hunger, thirst, homelessness, unemployment, when the state has more than enough bread, clean water, houses, and forms of income to spare. Influence is a conversion of knowledge to a bit of information thrown in with all other bits, so that instead of appearing as knowledge, information useful for development, or even information, facts useful for action, the bit of information is a reduction of facts to its parts, disjointed from its context, and unhinging of the facts for usefulness, much less of any action. Influence is the influence to sway aspirations of a populace to no longer vie power as a thing be obtained. Who cares about holding or carrying weight? The desire is to nudge weight at best or mainly blow on it. To see weight like a wall that you merely lean on when you are too tired to stand while waiting or too impatient to wait. But in all honesty, no diner can sell us on the influence of clean dishes before serving us food to eat. Influence's greatest influence is to move us away from materialism to an ethereal realm while living very much in the crumbling material world. I get it. In the sense of the real world, why not dwell on the stuff of virtual, vague, vibe, and fake? But at the end of the day, do you want a clean plate to eat on instead of starving? That's that piece.
And that's the episode, everybody. So thank you all for coming out.
Geographies of Threat was the book that I pulled from myself. Geographies of Threat and the production of violence, the state and the city and the city between us. That was Rasuls Book. I was able to index it. Never index a book. It's not fun. And this book this book may not look that long, but it's in columns. So this is way longer. For those listening, I want y'all to know it's like a 300-page book, but it's in columns. So every page has 2 columns. So it's much longer than it might look, but I would still recommend it. It's like a textbook on the state. Yeah. So your definition, you actually give multiple kinds of definitions within the book. But you say the configuration of the power of government, corporate interests, classes of elites, upper levels of the bureaucratic management class that implements a ruling class's goals and aims that sits atop accumulated economic base. We've hinted at it for a while now, but when people say the state, they do often mean government. So the government is like the public sector. You'll hear that term thrown around, and everything else effectively private. You know, there's different lanes of private or sub lanes of private, but it's private. Whether that's nonprofit, whether that's just corporate, whether that's small business, whether that's religion, like these things are all technically like privately owned. I don't even think sometimes the idea of private is understood within even this kind of concept. So usually the distinction is that's private, this is public. And then what's public is considered the state because that's the government. And then what's private is considered private interests, corporations, not the government, not the state.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you reject this distinction? And then what scholars do you draw from to do it? And then, you know, later I'll come back to this question. I'll ask it now, and I'll probably ask it again. Like, what are some examples that highlight the state of this conception of the state of the broader entity that you define it as not simply government? Because also, like, come back to the definition, like, you didn't come up with this definition out of thin air. I think that's even when I got pushback from other people sometimes, like, he didn't just say, hey, this is now the state, and, you know, like, no. So just kind of like lay out some why you reject those distinctions, where you're pulling that from, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, right. It's not like I'm just, 5% of coming up with the acronyms of, cash rules, everything around me, or something like that. No, exactly. No. So I think, I think the way to answer this question is first actually going through maybe some of who sort of informs this. So there's the first tier of a body of reading work that helps to inform this perspective. And then there's a second tier. It starts with really, Karl Marx and Das Kapital. But it really it's across a lot of work of Marx. But if I mention Das Kapital, nobody's going to read it anyway. But anyway, it's 3 long volumes, but nonetheless, laced within all 3 of those volumes, there are these discussions of his actual evolution of the state. Because what he mentions in volume 1 isn't even what he even mentions in volume 3. And then there's Max Weber.
Ingalls has a good write on.
Oh yeah. He does as well. Then there's Max Weber. Again, for people Googling, it'll be Max Weber, but it's German, and his theory on bureaucracies, which I'll get into, and maybe one of my responses to any of your questions. Antonio Gramsci, of course, through his prison notebooks. Stuart Hall, the cultural studies theorist out of the UK, and then Silvia Federici, the more political philosopher who helps us also understand the context of patriarchy and the state. And she definitely is a student of Engels. And then there's a second tier of people like Paul Robeson, Claudia Jones, C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney, Yanis Varoufakis, Benedict Anderson, and David Graeber. They provide then a more additional sort of context. So,
would you
different points? I was just going to say, at different points, I may refer to these people, in some way, but I just want to kind of give that to those names. Yeah, but go ahead. My bad.
I was just saying, would you include like Lenin and the State and Revolution in that?
Yes, but not necessarily as what informs my understanding. So, like these are the things that develop my understanding, and then there's things that then provide additional justification. And so it wasn't like I read Lenin and it helped to develop this understanding. It was like more like after the fact.
And plus that a lot of that book is a response to a lot of questions of the time anyway. It's not
right. And you also hear that I didn't mention like Fanon, example, right? Like there are people who deal with other matters, or there are people who I've ended up looking at on understanding the state more after going through these 2 tiers.
Screws a little bit, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel the same way on that. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is where I think, social contract theory is maybe relevant, to talk about, not necessarily because I agree with it, but it's been oftentimes referred to. If we can sort of think back in 2020, there was that one video of the sister during one of the George Floyd protests who talks about the failures of the social contract being broken or whatever else.
By the police, primarily, I think was what she was saying.
Yeah. But social contract theory makes, it's a philosophy. So it's not a fact. So it's not a thing that it actually existed. It's a thing. It's a way to explain why as human beings are we even living around each other. So, if we take the whole idea of resource dependency, let's say, again, the three of us aren't living around each other. We're not really aware of each other's existence, but we all hunt in the same sort of space. We all see a pond that we all draw fish from. There's deer in the area that we all hunt for. And so how do we ensure that we do not overeat? Right. So the first level of interacting with each other, we may create an agreement of controlling our hunting so that, any one of us won't starve, and so that's one level of a social contract that then is imagined, right? It is this sort of sharing of resources. Mm-hmm. And then we may, end up deciding, instead of living separately, why don't we just live in the same space, and we may have different then roles and functions. So instead of all three of us needing to go out and hunt, maybe only one of us hunts, another one, does the cooking, another one creates the sort of process to preserve the food for winter or whatever else, right? And so now all of a sudden, there's a contract around not just resource management, in terms of consumption, but also now there's a social contract around the roles of it, because it's just easier now, right? Because, if you're on your own, if you hunt and you bring the food back to your camp, then you go hunt again, there's other animals that are going to pick up the scent of the food that you just hunted, and they're going to come to your camp and eat that, food that you just hunted, right? Like, so having somebody else watch over your stuff, I mean, it's what people who are unhoused do. Like, it's
yeah.
And if you're hunting, if you're hunting all day, you don't get to eat.
So. Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. So, like, if we're in a house, while it may be sometimes, dangerous to interact with other people, it's beneficial to, end up forming alliances with other unhoused people, because now, we can create an encampment. All of us don't have to panhandle. Now all of a sudden, instead of just living out on the street, finding a park bench, we can actually make a tent, because at least one of us is going to be around to secure the tent so it's not stolen. And the things that we gather from the day now has a place. And so we can now build a home because we're now together. So that's a social contract, right?
That was John Locke, who was part of the major conceivers of that, right? Yeah. So I hope people listening can see, like, again, it's not real. It's not like there's not like a real time in which we started doing this, in at least recent history, maybe, a million years ago, since none of us are ascribing to, certain sort of religious doctrine of, creation, right. We've been, right. But in more recent times, that's not, we haven't operated off of that, primitive sharing of resource sort of function. So, but going back to what I said about different roles, how do we then all of a sudden create distinctive differences in that shared society? Maybe one of our roles becomes way more important for all of us than the other. Is it the hunter? Is it the cook? Is it the food preserver? So whichever one of us has a role that all of a sudden is seen to be more important. Let's say there's a whole bunch of really harsh winters that we experience. So all of a sudden food preservation becomes so vital, and that's my area. All of a sudden, I now can ask for more food, more clothing and so forth. And so now all of a sudden we get the creation of elites. And, so because now we have these sort of social classes
that are built around these roles. Now, we're not talking about the Marx classes of owners and so on, but I'm just talking about in this sort of natural world society structure.
Right.
And so, but let's say after going through several harsh winters, we don't have any harsh winters anymore. But I've gotten so used to the privileges that had been afforded to me because I was the master food preserver. Now I'm trying to find a way to maintain that elite status. Right. And so maybe I do something extra special with the food preservation that maintains the dependency. Maybe I move it to a far off place that none of y'all know, or, I create an even better technique that extends the life even longer, but I don't tell y'all how to do that, And so elites then are formed from this. And so,
and like you said, it's elites. It's not like, it's not, you're using it as an example, like one person, but then that becomes a family.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like,
Exactly.
It becomes a kind of whole cabal.
Exactly.
Yeah. And not out of some conspiracy, just like you're demonstrating, like in some ways, almost an evolution of just
a society.
Yeah.
A society's formed, right? And so that's what we begin to see. I mean, so this is now where we move from a conceptual idea of thinking to actual real. So how do then these monarchies, these examples of elites form? Well, they become these families that were able to, ward off, warring factions from some other particular area. They were maybe the blacksmiths, so they were able to make the weaponry in a certain particular way. Something put them into a situation that created dependency. And so we see then the emergence of certain families, Austria, or what's now present day Austria, but nonetheless has been Austria, for, in terms of the society for quite some time, emerge, right? Especially in response to preventing the East from coming into Europe, the Turks, the Huns, and all these types of people. So we have monarchies that start to form from fighting off, same thing in Spain, who fights off, the lead families that help to sort of fight off the Moors, and so that Spain can now become independent, from the Moors. So monarchies are formed. So that's the emergence of the state, is the governance system from that, those monarchies, right? And we're talking about governance. We're not talking about some movie sense of just sitting there and drinking wine and eating grapes or whatever else. You have to manage sewer systems, and you have to create festivals so that people had a social life, holidays, and so forth. But you also have to create mechanisms for people to maintain a perception that they need you or they need your family. And so this is what we're starting to see, both in terms of an understanding of state government, but also the state that I'm trying to also figure out, right?
Because you can see the governing part of it, and you can also see the interests that definition.
Exactly.
You can see that at the same time, and that's not, the binary isn't actually what it is. Like that is soft, like we were saying about government and private.
No. Yeah, because I mean,
and we're not even at capitalism yet. We're just
not at all.
Yeah,
not at all. Right. So this is this is like prehistory state, like Rome, Greece, in particular, right? And so we move into the feudal period because resources are amassed within a territory, and you've created, as a monarchy, you've created alliances with other groups to maintain power. They're fine with your power because, you as a monarchy takes all the hits, but also, you're a social and cognitive unifier in the people, right? And so, that people's faith in you helps to keep the social order in place.
It's a form of legitimizing the social order too, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so we see then this political philosophy, especially in France, emerging around what's called the estates of the realm, estates of the realm, estates of the realm. And there's three estates of the realm. There's, of course, the monarchy. There's then the religious, order, the church. And then there's the aristocracy, the people who own land, and territory. There wasn't like all three were, equal power. It's just that you had three estates of the realm that function in that way. And there's a relationship and dynamic between the three. And so if the monarchy needed certain things, they could leverage monies or resources from the other two. If the other two needed protection, they could leverage the monarchy to, help protect them because the army is under the monarchy, right?
So a lot of the interests converging, right? Start converging.
Yeah. Yep.
It's fun. Okay. It's funny even when you watch shows like, for all its flaws, like Game of Thrones. Some of this is there.
Yeah,
it's completely there.
If you get past all the nudity and the rape scenes and all that, like and the incestuous stuff, like these struggles between, like you said, those realms are demonstrated in not just Game of Thrones, but in all that era of shows, what we like to call the Middle Ages or whatever. Like you can see those conflicts. I actually think a lot of those shows do a good job of demonstrating those, beyond all the drama, demonstrating some of those conflicts that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, George R. Martin and, of course, more currently Frank Herbert with Dune, Frank Herbert more so. I mean, he's making a commentary using this feudal period of the past as an explanation for the present, right? And so these families were key to ushering a move away from, former oppression, right? Former ways in which what was before was not desirable, but these families somehow aided us with coming out of the dark, in many different ways. So the estates of the realm are those three. It's interesting in French political philosophy, they have a fourth, but the fourth is actually a counter against the other three. The fourth estate is the people, and that's expressed through either schools of learning or more specifically the press. And so the fourth estate is not a part of the three. The fourth estate is in opposition of the three. So if people ever heard the fourth estate, that's where that comes from. It comes from,
And I even think people think that's like there's three branches of government, and then there's the press, and I think that's what a lot of people think the fourth estate is.
Yeah, no, yeah. So it comes, it comes from this, it comes from this very old, specific sort of French political philosophy, and so on one hand, this is where then we can understand state government, right? Expand, understanding, but then also a separate thing, because when we start recognizing that the monarchy can't operate on its own, it does have to have this other relationship, because especially as the monarchy is expanding its territory, right? To be way more than a city or way more than just like, a certain smaller area. They need to be bankrolled by other entities that has amassed money. So the church amasses money from the donations of the people, and the aristocracy amasses money from ownership of land, because people having to pay rent, on the land to farm, to live, and so forth. So this moves us then to a period of what's called absolutism, which creates then stronger government. So this is this is then the time period where an understanding of state government comes into play, because it wasn't enough for the monarchy just to operate as a monarchy. You had to have now departments of handling different things, a department of war, right? A department of the currency, of the coin, right? And so you had to create a larger system to manage stuff that wasn't just the church and the aristocracy. You had to create your own sort of what we would eventually call bureaucracy, but this is not bureaucracy yet, right? But you have to create these structures, right?
Are you, real quick, when you're pulling from this, because I could just, I'm good with what you're saying, but I can hear people's correct. Are you pulling primarily from Europe, or are you saying that these feudal orders also exist?
Yeah, I'm pulling primarily from Europe. I mean, yes, there's an understanding of feudal Japan, but that's not within this particular space, or that non-European base. And I hate to say European, because of course they're not calling it.
Yeah, what Europe is it?
Kind of Europe, right? Like because they're not unified in any respect, right? At this particular time period, it's just that it's in the continent that we now call Europe,
right?
And so and what we now kind of perceive as being somehow so-called unified, right?
And white now,
right? Exactly.
Right.
So this is not to say that there aren't empires and other structures that are happening on the continent of Africa, South America, and Asia, but they don't contribute to, our sort of present day understanding of the state and so forth, because, just quote unquote, they didn't win.
Yeah. And they were on they were on their own path of development that wasn't intertwined with Europe once upon a time, what we call Europe. This is where Watts and Rodney's work is very, very helpful.
Exactly. So, I mean, there might have been intersections tied to trading of goods, but those trading of goods were more so helping those entities from those different European powers expand, right? And so, and this is why I was mentioning certain names. So, David Graeber's work on debt is so key, because, we think that in particular, something like slavery is an outgrowth of, capitalist development for accumulation of wealth. Well, no, first it was about debt. It was about paying off debt, because the crown didn't need slaves. Like it already had, slaves at home. You know what I mean? Like, and they already had their wealth, right? So, so it was these lower tier landowners that had to pay rent to larger landowners, and they had to pay off their debt. So, and they couldn't get any more loans, from banks. So, these missions to go to another, territory to set up a settlement, to expand a settlement, to work that settlement and make it grow, was a part of paying off debt. And they didn't realize that it was going to be that much of a, successful venture, and so it then expanded to the point in which real world, now it's profitable for everybody, because it's now a scheme where, the local landowner in Mexico City, is paying off, his debt or her debt, and they're sending it up the chain to the next person and to the next person and then to the crown. And it was like, well, let's keep this going, And
it's like that's that mercantile stage, that early mercantile stage of capitalism. And I think we often just jump to the industrial era of it. But yeah, and it's like they didn't even know in some ways they were going to become capitalists, like that particular merchant class and the landowners, they didn't even, because they weren't actually originally at the top. Like you said, it was the crown, right? And then eventually, like we talk about bourgeois revolution, but go ahead.
Yeah. So then you move into this era of constitutional and contractual states where either there's a shared government between the crown, who now has to share power to not, to to not be removed, to no longer exist, to not have their family exterminated. So
these places are also setting up territory that you talk about elsewhere. So now they have way more sway against the crown, because now I got a colony over here. Yeah,
exactly. You know, I can raise as big of an army as you can. You know, and so that's a contractual, you know, sort of example. Or some places just completely got rid of the monarchy, right?
France.
And yeah, you know, United States, right? You know, these are all good understandings of state government development. But also within this, you then have people like, you know, again, Marx, but Antonio Gramsci in particular, who really does sort of say that we can't have a narrow sense of the state being just government, because, you know, from, of course, being in prison, from clearly having political activity that threatened the greater society, he started to recognize that there was a political society and there was a civil society, and both of those combined, you know, was what he was up against, right? So it wasn't just the police and the army and the legal systems and so forth. You know, it was also, you know, educational systems and the trade unions, you know, and so forth, that were also, you know, out to get them. If people sort of sometimes may, you know, Google search or whatever else, visually, you know, the state may be represented either as a circle with you know, two halves to it, or a triangle split in half, right? And the bottom part is called the base, and the top part is called the superstructure. Some people may not realize. Some people think that like either the superstructure is the state or the base is the state. And no, technically both of them are the state. So once you begin to understand that both of them are the state, then you begin to sort of see that there's a dynamic that's going on in relationship to the two, right? You know, one is not technically, you know, completely running the other, even though, for example, from the superstructure, ideas are produced, tastes are produced. So our whole perception of etiquette, you know, wants and desires are all coming out of the superstructure. You know, the base is still, you know, vital, because that's where the production is. That's where industry, you know, that's where the material goods that help to create the accumulation of wealth even are happening. So there's a dynamic, you know, going on between the two.
And that's where, you know, people overuse the word sometimes, but that's the dialectical relationship between like the base and the superstructure, that they're not. Yeah. I know I can hear you, you know, saying like that's where there's not a kind of like you said, one is running the other necessarily, in the sense that there is a exchange happening, and it's a dynamic relationship. It's not a static thing where I own the factory and therefore people who make the culture are simply just you know, workers for me.
Right.
There's a way that the culture will dictate back what I even need to make. As the factory owner, to, you know, even stay relevant within this dialectic or whatever. Right?
Yeah. But then keep the state going, because you said
you know, I was just gonna say that, you know, so I mean, there's so many ways in which people sort of overcomplicate, you know, dialectical materialism. Like, so the most important thing to just draw from really simply is that, you know, reality is not based upon simply our thoughts. They're, they're based upon our material conditions, right? So, and our material conditions are based upon a contest or conflict between, you know, two oppositional forces, right? And so, so we can sort of look at, you know, throughout time, not necessarily an evolution of philosophical ideology, so enlightenment and all this other type of stuff. Like, no, you know, history is based upon this opposition, the conflicts of the opposition, and who ultimately wins in those conflicts. We can see that over and over and over again. these things did not evolve through handshakes, right? These things evolved through, forces and competitions, right? So the elite, so the elite emerges, the monarchy emerges out of a conflict, right?
Yeah.
But then, they have to maintain power, through not only, beating the people, at bay, but they also have to keep, whoever they bring alliances in with at bay, whereas the church or the aristocracy. And so eventually, in some certain cases, the monarchy lost and the aristocracy won, or the monarchy lost and the religious order, won, right? And doesn't always have to be necessarily the church, because we can think about Iran and, and the religious order, winning in Iran post-revolution, in the, 80s, right? So, I think though that's really, hugely important, that some of this explains state government and the basis for how state government has had to evolve. But at least for me, and thinking about then, while we can think of state government, so I still use the term state government, but I don't call the state government, if that makes sense, right?
All right.
Right, it's a part of it, but it ain't.
Yeah, right,
Not the full thing. Okay.
right. Because there's state government, there's state
And there's also different types of government. So state government is a specific type of government, because you're talking about a state versus a confederation or something that may not be within a state, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so, but this gets us to try to understand then the classes that, if we're thinking about, again, dialectical materialism, what's the conflict, the oppositional forces, who are the oppositional forces? In certain cases, we do see clear winners, right? But in other cases, we still see some of the old families still being present.
Okay.
They don't totally die off in all cases, yeah.
And so if they didn't die off and they're still benefiting from the system, is it that they lost? No, they won, so they lost governance, but they didn't lose actual control.
They didn't lose their class status at all.
Well, and more importantly, so, they didn't not only lose their class status, but they're, my argument is they're the people outside. They're the owner of the aquarium.
Right.
So, the owner of the aquarium is not inside the aquarium, taking the food from the top of the tank and giving it to each fish. The owner of the aquarium is not inside the aquarium, moving the air filter around to the best location to produce the bubbles or whatever, the owner of the aquarium isn't inside. They may put their hand inside, but they're not inside the aquarium, moving certain things around on the sort of rocks or sand. They're on the, they are out of the state. They're outside of the circle. They're outside of the rectangle, because all they have to do is just sit there and then they get the benefits, the wealth accumulation.
And
they'll create.
The aquarium is working for them.
Because
the same way it's working for a boss either, to your point.
And so in essence, they've created then the state to be this thing that now, because before, a monarchy in particular had to be in this thing to run the thing.
Right.
And this is where you get beheadings and all this other type of stuff. And that's just too much, right? That's too much work. That's just too much headache and so forth. So why not just abdicate running the whole thing? Hey, let the aristocracy run it. Let the church run it, or whoever. We're going to just step outside and we'll just keep getting, the wealth the wealth from it, because our wealth funded this in the first place, right? And so that then gives then this understanding that everything, all of us are inside this thing.
Yeah.
In varying classes. So there's a ruling elite outside, but then there's governing elites inside. There are, other types of classes inside, right? Managers, workers,
Well, yeah.
right?
Managerial class.
Yeah,
Professional managerial class.
and the elites that are outside only have to interact with this in certain sort of context of banking. Everybody got to put their money in a bank.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? So nothing. There's not a separate banking system. There's not a separate food system. For wealthy. This is also adds to the kind of the stupidity of standing of Black Wall Street being somehow independent, because nothing, no space can be completely independent.
You're still in the aquarium.
Yeah. But
even
also,
when you're outside of the aquarium, you can't.
Yeah.
You still got to you still have a relationship to the aquarium. Like you're not.
You still got to, yeah.
So it's like,
yeah. I forgot that wealthy little small island and off of Miami Beach that has that the highest sort of number of people who are wealthy or whatever else. These are
Florida Keys or something.
Yeah, well, no, it's not the Florida Keys. It's that, it's now none of these people are the elites outside of the aquarium. So I'm not saying that, but these people have enough significant money in their sort of community, but they still got to have a gas station.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not like they have a privatized gas line that goes and gets crude oil, refines it, and like shoots it to their car or whatever else. They still got to have a BP gas station that still has to be attended by some worker, because ain't none of their kids going to work at that BP gas station. They still got to, when they still have a craving for some snacks, they still got to go to a store and buy something in a package that they didn't make on their little island. So there is always a dependency. There's always, there's nothing can be off the grid. That sense, right? And
yeah, like we said in that one, I think we were doing the myth of the circulating black dollar, but like it doesn't even make sense that when people talk about keeping money in their community or keeping all the especially under capitalism, that like shit's moving it's in
everywhere.
Circulation. Everything's in circulation. So if shit's not in circulation, you're probably poor. Like that's actually unless you are the ruling class that has like a domicile or something, like, and everything's produced there. Like you are gonna have to have food imported in and things are got to be exported out. That's just in the economy. Like so that idea is going all the way back to your point about power analysis. It's a silly idea that doesn't have any understanding about the world's working. If you're thinking about life, particularly in 2024, as some kind of idea that the dollar just stays in the community and it doesn't leave.
Right.
That just doesn't, like, that's not, like you said, even for rich people, the gas still has to be imported from somewhere else. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Oil doesn't all come from the ground where they live, so.
Yeah. Yeah, and so like for example, Sylvia Federici and her work on, a range of her work, thinking about the creation of patriarchy and so forth. For her, she doesn't just go to this sort of ahistorical sort of sense that it's just the rule of men over women. Like that doesn't, for her, that doesn't make any sense, right? Like there has to be a structural thing. This is not a natural order thing. This is not a thing that has always existed in reality. So she can specifically look at the writings of the Magna Carta specifically, are the first time in terms of property relationships. So property ownership it becomes important, right? Property ownership is how one can move from being a serf, a peasant, to, moving up the ladder to aristocracy, right? And there's no ability really to move up the ladder. You gotta, you either gotta, fight somebody to get it, or somehow be married into, some type of family in that regards. But anyway, so she establishes that patriarchy as the term comes from the relationship with the church, patria, right? And so it is about then the church's sort of control that slowly began to increase over time, where the church might have been a minor player at one particular point in time, but they become a major player in a later period of time. And how? Because they began to accumulate far more land than the aristocracy, right? Because, when people die, they have this, religious loyalty, and they give their land to, if they don't have any heirs, they give their land to the church as a donation. I mean, still to this present day, the Catholic Church is one of the largest landowners, in the world, still to this day. And it's not because of the churches that they just own. They own also scores of other property, right? We'll be seeing a switch to that because, currently there's this big land grab with all these, wealthy billionaires currently, right? Like, for example, I think something like right now, people, it's like 5 of them, Bezos is one of them. They're already at a particular point where they're owning something like 20% of the land in the United States. So they're buying property at the property. So there's a new relationship that's going to be emerging, very soon. But anyway, so Silvia Federici makes this particular argument point that Magna Carta, identifies that women have the capacity to own property, which is huge, significant, but they can only own it because as a widow, because at the particular time period, a lot of men are dying on battlefields on behalf of the crown. And so the Magna Carta, so the Magna Carta makes it so that these women as widowers can own land. The church didn't like that. And so the church begins to conceive of some ways to get this property, because what ends up happening is that when this woman dies, she can then bequeath it to her children, right? And so they can they can't get this property that before that they could have gotten it, right?
Right.
Because once the man dies,
it's up for sale. You can just snatch it.
It's up for sale, or whenever the wife, finally dies, it just automatically gets, comes over to them, right? Because they'll allow them. Yeah,
you can't funnel it. You can't funnel it based on the before that rule, like you just said. Yeah,
yeah. So she makes the argument that that's why the whole burning of witches becomes a popular thing. So they fabricate documents. They fabricate rumor and suspicion around these women who actually own land. And it's through their death that they can get the land. So they make the claim that they're witches. Everybody is going to then believe them because it's the church. They burn them at the stake, and then they get the property. Right?
Yeah, the church takes the land.
And so
I forgot about that one.
So it's a brilliant analysis, but it's only an analysis that you can get to if you step out of, and look at one. Historical materialism, you start seeing the patterns, right, that emerges. And so why would you have so many burnings, right? So many. And then, of course, it carries over to the colonies. Like what? I mean, it goes on for so long, right? I mean, this is lynching, right? This is lynching. We just call it, witch burnings, but they're nonetheless lynching because it all of a sudden controls behavior because there people are seeing like, well, if you say something wrong, if you start, challenging the government, whatever else, they're going to accuse you of being a witch and you're going to burn and whatever else, right? So it's serving that social control, factor, but it's also stealing property from, these widowers, right? And so it's this scheme for that. And over time, then these women who are property owners no longer then have influence in decision making and voting because, if when they have contractual state government, you can vote, only property owners can vote, right? And if you don't have property anymore, you can't vote. And so once then these certain classes of women now no longer can vote, they lost their wealth. All of a sudden, they're moved to another particular type of status, and so it's a very different understanding of the history of patriarchy that makes it less superstitious and more concrete, and more. And so then you can understand why there are sort of pushes to own the reproductive, capacities of women and so forth when you're you have this understanding of the relationship with property, the control of property, and so forth. It's not just, there's always been it's not
just yeah. My question is, also during this time, all this is happening, you just laid out the education of women, not allowing them to read. Is this also plays into that as well?
It does, but that's later. So that's later. So for people for listening, Magna Carta is like the 1200s, right? And I'm not going to try to do no history from the 1200s to the present. So please, so those listeners, you're fine. We've done long-term discussions.
We've done that before. Yeah.
So Magna Carta is 1200s. So we're talking about like from maybe 1200s to like 1600s, where women of a certain class. These are aristocrats. Like these are not regular women, right?
Okay, gotcha.
Right. So these are aristocrats. These are another class of women. Remember, like, so the whole notion of gender equity, like regular peasant women, that's a whole nother story
of gender conversation. Right.
Yeah. Women who are slaves, like, yeah. So we're talking about aristocrats, right? And they're losing their influence because of this property theft that's happening, right? So then once you get to the 1600s, where most women are not owning property at all, right? So they still may hold their wealth and a status, but they hold no property. And so then ultimately, that's a fragile existence. They can't pass on anything then to their children except for maybe their money, but their money is also connected to the value of the currency of the government. And so if the government change hands and the currency's gone. So then once you get to the 1700s and then eventually 1800s, now you have then these labor unrests because now, the bulk of women aren't wealthy, right? There's not even a significant number of wealthy. They're all in the working class, right? And I know in Geography is a Threat, I talk about the Petersboro massacre, which was a protest for voting rights for men and women, so universal suffrage in the UK, just before the 1800s. And the way to, Stilwell Federici talks about this, there was a union built upon, not an official labor union, but a union between working class men and working class women against government. But the way in which the state was able to break that union was they gave men the ability to vote, right? So the Petersboro massacre is called that because they had a protest. The army is sent over there on horseback. They trample the protesters. There's outrage. So there's all this support for the people. And so the crown thinks through how, and government. So remember, the parliament exists at this time too. They're thinking, how can we, House of Lords is like, how can we think of maintaining this power? Let's give half of this group the ability to vote. And so House of Commons, is something is part of this history. So it's not just the House of Lords, it's all aristocrats. You have everyday people also being represented, but everyday men. And so basically the laboring working class men betrayed the working class women. And so then by the time you get into the, entire 1800s, you have, it devolves into, everything that we can sort of see and understand in terms of labor action, labor activity, wages, reproduction, control of reproduction. All those things begin to emerge and continue to the present day. If we only think of these concepts as state government, this is why then certain sort of forms of political understanding talk about, like, communism specifically talks about no state, right? Because they know a state ultimately will go down this road, right? There's not a good state, right? Like, states by nature of what they are, especially if they're beyond just simply being a government, can ultimately sort of always move in the direction of corruption, because you have to maintain all, this entire sort of arrangement of relationships. And so, again, that's, this is why communism is not socialism. Socialists sort of make the argument that there could be a state, that has better sort of relationships between production, and communism is like, love,
no state.
A transition, like socialism is supposed to be a transition. So during socialism,
exactly,
you can have a state that
you're
using the Marxist conception is dictated by the proletariat, and then the withering away. That's a whole. But I'm just saying, like, but in the end, that's not the goal, is to have a state. But I think often that trips people up, because if I'm thinking that the state is a government and not like all these other things that you've laid out, then it can get into like, well, people need services, or we need to be able to divide up resources, going all the way back even to the conception of a social contract, like how much fish come out of the pond. Like, we think that when it becomes that, then people get very anti-government, and they think they're being anti-state. So it's like, well, Cuba still has a government, so Cuba's not socialist or whatever, and that's not. But they think that by Cuba having a government, that inherently means that they have a state. I'm not saying they don't. I'm just saying, like, they think that those things are one and the same. So then we're trying to stay out of the anarchists versus, like, I'm not interested in these debates really, but I'm saying, like, but it becomes this thing where it's like government equals bad no matter what. For some people on the so-called left, or even this more libertarian kind of approach. Because they assume that that's what the state is, when it's like what Rasul is saying, is there's so many more elements that play into that. Because honestly, these smaller countries don't even, they have their elites, but they're so wrapped up in the bigger states, like of a United States, of an empire. I would be interested how Rasul sees it, but there's only so much those smaller places could even do to form a state in the way we're talking about it, relative to how you're going to deal with the United States or Europe at its high, or European powers at their height, like the British Empire or something. You're just a client state, like you're a semi-colony, or you are just a colony, Yeah,
again, the analogy is not necessarily, flawless, but, again, thinking about aquariums, and, clearly I had, when I was a child, I had to do a lot of aquariums, clearly, and it wasn't the ones I created. Like, my father loved the aquariums, but I had to be the one to clean them and all that type of stuff. Just because you scoop out the fish and put them into another aquarium, doesn't mean that's an improvement. Like,
right.
If your fish get bigger, you put them in a larger aquarium, So we perceive that somehow, there's a better state, right? Not recognizing that there should not be aquariums, right? But it's because have been in the aquarium for so long that we can't even imagine, what it is. Because when we're in the aquarium, inside the aquarium looking out, we don't see, oh, they're free out there. No, it just looks like another aquarium next to ours, because because you have no perception of what's an aquarium and what's not an aquarium. Everything's an aquarium, right? You're in one, and whatever I'm looking at must be in another one. It's just a bigger one, right, or something like that. You don't have memories of an ocean, or river, or sea.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah. So I think, again, I think maybe, there's so much to this that, we're trying to do our best to try to cover it within this, sake of this episode. Maybe another particular time I could come back for something specifically tied to Stuart Hall and police in the crisis, and talking about that particular important contribution in and of itself, because that specific contribution itself really sort of highlights this dynamic and relationship to multiple forces that are not just government, right? How do you sort of have this sense of a moral panic, and how necessary having a moral panic allows you to then to enact, not just different policies that are disastrous, but actual sort of changes within, all of society.
Question of the state is interesting when you are trying to move out of capitalism, and there is this tendency by some to say abolish the state. Again, I don't think they have any conception in most cases of what you just laid out when they say that. I think they just mean abolish. Like, I don't want, again, I try to not go in on that side of the table, but I'm saying, like, they have a sense like it's just hierarchy and power, abolish that, more so like horizontalize power or something. I think that's generally what they think. And I don't think that's all bad, but if you're trying to figure out what to do, let's say you did get when we think about in the past, when countries with former colonies do get some level of it, flag independence, and are trying, at least in the early stages of some of these places, we're really trying to govern and do things for the benefit of the people. How does a state work in that scenario? I think we are clearer on capitalism and feudalism, but when you're trying to do, even if you're not calling it explicitly socialism, or if you are, you're trying to marshal your resources for the good of the people, because you came out of a revolution, but you run into these conflicts because you still, I know we didn't get to talk as much about cities. We'll probably have to make a part 2 for that, but just like, I agree. You have all these old things that are still lying around, thinking about cities, because there's something you say in the book about you can get all this independence, but the cities are often still structured the way that they were prior, to independence. And they kind of, it's because the way cities are structured, they tend to, they're not just buildings, like they're built to create a certain way of life. And it's hard to get out of that because cities don't really change. Like the actual infrastructure and architecture of them don't change. But like, how do you work through that? What's your kind of sense of that? Like when you are trying to marshal the resources for the people, even though you still have elite classes and all of that, the people have somewhat seized some of those things. Like, how do you, and this is a question everybody's trying to figure, not everybody, but people who are serious about revolution try to figure out, but how do you marshal those things while you're still in a state? Because once you get independence, the state doesn't just die,
Yeah. So, I think one thing that you're alluding to is just this notion of, let's say, especially we saw in a heightened example during the 1960s and maybe early 1970s, when a lot of specifically countries on the continent of Africa were becoming independent. Right? Mm-hmm. So think about Kinshasa with the Congo, and so how do what happens the day after,
right?
Right. The old city isn't gone, right? The old roads aren't gone. You're not building a new city. So you're still operating out of the old infrastructure. And so Patrice Lumumba was up against the wall because he was still dealing with and operating with, under old infrastructure, right? So a lot of the Belgians that were living, in the country fled. And so he needed, other French speakers who had some administrative experience to come and live in the country. So, Haitians moved there. And so, the noted, director Raoul Peck, his family was a part of that group of Haitians that go to the Congo and try to assist in working as clerical workers and so forth. Like, because, people in the Congo were kept out of, these particular type of positions. So they had no knowledge of how to just, how do you turn the lights on? How do you maintain a water filtration system the day after, right? Like these
how do you accounting and 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 you don't just learn that shit overnight.
No, definitely not.
It's a very scary sort of type of thought, but it's a thought that we when we start thinking about those very material and practical things, we can sort of see how we've been playing around with abolition and decolonization and all that type of stuff. Like Fanon said, decolonization is the spectacular flight of capital. Once capital leaves, your country, decolonization is on. And that's not a good thing, because, there's going to be terror, because you have different forces fighting over control. There's incompetence because people don't know how to do stuff. Again, how do you, I don't know how to run a sanitation, program,
And
I know how to drive a truck,
even so we don't get too caught up on the governing, like even on the private side, quote unquote, how to run the business to do whatever the service is. You don't know how to do that either. You know what I'm saying? Like,
I mean, people are gonna have to eat food. People have to eat food. So how do you distribute food? Well, I mean, what's the new currency? Because you can't just distribute all the food equally. Because you don't even know how to produce the food, right? At that scale, right?
I mean, medical equipment.
Oh my goodness. It's
medicine.
I mean, it was amazing what he attempted to do in just a short amount of days. That he's alive. But these are the serious questions. This is what actual decolonization is. That's what you're thinking of. It's not no imagination and all this. I mean, like, are we capable of feeding 50 people, 500 people, 5,000, 50,000, 500,000? Because it's not like people are just going to go and live out in the countryside,
right? Especially if you don't have those skills. Yeah,
and you couldn't have everybody go out to the countryside because everybody going to start hunting way more than they can, they should be. And so next thing you know, I mean, people going to chop down more trees than necessary to build homes and, keep warm. All these things will
likely occur. This is why the idea of just flat out abolishing the state doesn't make any sense to me.
It's irresponsible.
Yeah. It's
completely irresponsible.
Yeah.
But another part of answering the question goes to something that I really got out of, I've dropped her name a few times, but not because she talks about the state, but because she talks about, Haiti. So we always think about Haiti. And so it's Get a Child, again, we're world making after empire. And so she makes the argument point that, while it was amazing for the Haitian Revolution to occur, we forget what happens afterwards. And it's not just, the French imposing the debt. It's also that, Haiti then basically colonizes the Dominican Republic side, before it's Dominican Republic. It colonizes the Spanish speaking side of the island. This is some of the history of tension between the two sides. Haiti colonizes then the Spanish speaking side and almost brutalizes them in terms of the governance of that other particular side, because they needed a labor class to run their independent, country, right?
And Dominican, to be fair, was also not always on their side during the revolution either.
No. And so, and so that
justifies it, but I'm just
right.
Yeah.
And so, but also, remember there was French and Spanish, so they were also dealing with two different colonizers. So, but then the other part is, so Getterchild makes the point is that that's when it was clear that we had to move away from abolition, because just abolishing slavery in Haiti was insufficient. Because you got rid of slavery, but that didn't get rid of imperialism that created, the debt situation and your dependency. And now you have to invest in French banks. But also, it didn't get us to think about, freeing other slave, societies, right? And so she notes very early on that they moved away from that. So why we are so hung up on trying to use it is just, it makes no sense.
They moved away from abolition.
Because, and this is why then they move towards this whole notion of anti-imperialism. So thinkers as early as the 1820s, 1830s, 1850s, after the Haitian independence, are starting to think like, man, we may have made a mistake, not ending slavery, but thinking that was it.
Yeah, like we won. Yeah, like
that was enough.
Yeah.
And so there was the seeds of the whole, Pan-Africanist ideas of thinking about, ending imperialism, because if we can end imperialism, then we may finally be freed of aquariums and now are in an ocean, and we can now figure out how we can live in oceans. We can live in societies that, are completely sort of open. So then that lays the seed work that ultimately then, takes fruit in the 50s and the 60s in the continent of Africa, because they take heed of it. So it's not about just abolishing, colonialism. It was trying to do something more, but they had to create a base, and unfortunately, some weren't able to get it started, and some weren't able to take it further. And
some were just turncoats, right? Like
and some were turncoats. So I'm saying that so I'm giving that those two responses as response to that particular question, where how I've thought about it is it's unknown, because it's clear that it's not enough. What we've learned is each step of the way is not enough. It was not enough just to end slavery.
Yeah.
And we learned that from after the Haitian Revolution, but from the independence of various countries in the continent of Africa, but also in South America, then it wasn't enough to end colonialism. So that's
the nation state doesn't. I think that was kind of the conception. I haven't read that book in a while. We're talking about world making, but like she talks about. I mean, because one other thing they try to do is really marshal the UN, and that we see in Palestine particularly is that is horribly failed as far as the UN being some kind of anti-colonial savior or something. But at the time, it was a new body, right? So it made sense,
right,
in that era to try that. You're talking about post World War II. In 2024, we just see that the UN is just not really capable. It can do some things, but it's just a lot of drafts and resolutions and honestly just cleanup jobs,
Yeah.
If they're doing their job. Half the time they don't even clean up. They make shit worse like they did in Haiti. But yeah. I think I don't know if there's a perfect answer to those things. If there were, I don't know if we'd be having this conversation. But yeah, I think we'll probably have to come back. I thought we were going to get to cities, but I don't think we're even going to touch on that. That's what's actually in the book for the people that's listening. Like most of this shit isn't even in the book. This is actually Geography is a Threat today. This is a book. But so yeah, we will return at some point to deal with cities, but I do think because I think cities, to kind of just give people some preview, if we get around to it, is just if you really want to see a lot of what we talked about conceptually, and if you really want to see it materially, I think, and there's in the chapter 3 of the book, A Laundering of Black Rage really lays that out, and it also helps demystify laundering, I think, because you can watch it in how the state breaks
in
down.
real time.
Yeah, you can watch how the state builds the cities, and then, like Rasul said, the city ends up hiding the state, and you can go outside and watch trucks go up and down the street, and you can watch laundering. You don't have to think about it in this kind of just a conceptual framework.
Yeah, abstract way.
Because even if you are into the buy black thing or whatever the fronts that we joke about, somebody has to deliver some shit to your door. You know what I'm saying? Like somebody has to create an ad and there has to be electricity that's up that allows you to watch it on your, like all of that's real. Like it's not just, nothing's actually virtual in the way that we think it is. Things still have to move across lines. So the city really helps us understand how we are part of that process and how we are kind of like spatially placed within it and all the different categorizations of stuff. I think helps us see laundering in a way that I don't think I only alluded to in my original essay, but that chapter I think really gives us some more meat for people who want to accuse us of any kind of abstraction, even though all of y'all are abstraction, but I'll cut that out. But so we'll be back for that. I hope y'all got some good lessons on just the conceptions of the state. It's a word that gets thrown around a lot. And, like Rasul said at the beginning, this isn't about accuracies in the sense of just having the most precise definition and therefore you have won the battle of what the state is. It's more so trying to understand what's actually happening to us and what we are trying to struggle against and kind of